What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Angling Addicts Pacific Northwest. This is going to be video number 3 in our series of winter steelhead prep. And in this week's video, we're going to be talking about what has to be my favorite technique when it comes to targeting steelhead, salmon, what have you. This is definitely my go-to rig, and that's going to be fishing with spinners. Now, what we're going to cover in this week's video is going to be basically what it is, the bare minimum is what you need to get this rig started. Also how you can get it set up, and then we'll also cover some tips at the end for basically how you should approach the area that you're going to fish, and then how you can fish this rig to be most effective. Now, I always say that this probably has to be one of the easiest ways to go out and target winter steelhead, and when I say that, I mean it more generalized as really this is probably the cheapest and easiest way to be able to go out and get started to target some fish. And that's simply because of how little is needed to get this rig set up and not a whole lot of know-how. It's easier rig, I think, in my opinion, to be able to, for a beginner, to be able to get this basic setup and to be able to go out on the water and do some experimenting and kind of fine-tune the technique as they begin to learn kind of how the whole concept of it works. Now, getting into rods and reels for this setup, I mean, you can take a spinner and tie it onto a trout rod and go out and hook into a fish, but having a rod that's got some extra length to it and then having a reel that also can handle a good amount of line or some heavy enough line to be able to handle a big fish if you go out there and get on a big fish. So what I typically fish, and I have been around here, is in between a 9 and a 10 foot. And you know, you guys have probably seen my Cabela's Pro Guide that has seen a lot of fish, thankfully, and that is on obviously a bait casting setup. And then another one for the spinning setup is just the Lamiglass X11, the spinning setup, and that one's 9'6". Now talking about the rods, the reason you want something with a little bit of extra length is so you can kind of control your line a little bit better, which ultimately is going to give you better control of your spinner out there. And also you want something with a bit of backbone. This Lamiglass that I have here is set for drift, float, and spinning. This one is rated for a 1.5 ounce to 1.5 ounce lure weight. And so this thing can handle a big lure. Say I want to go out and I'm fishing the lower Columbia and I want to throw a 1 ounce weight. This rod's going to be able to handle a 1 ounce lure on there, as opposed to where, say, I've got my, this is a Lamiglass Cascade Pro. Now this is a light rod and it's 9'6", but where it's rated, it's not going to give me it's not really going to allow me to get that lure out effectively, just because I'm overloading that rod's capacity. And now what we're talking about is the specs that you'll see on your rod blanks, and it's going to tell you the range that you have for a lure weight. And so, as I said, this one being a 1/2 ounce to 1.5 ounce. Now, that doesn't mean you can't fish something heavier or something lighter. That's just kind of a general guideline for you to go by. And really, right in the middle of that range is where your rod is going to be optimized in performance. And so, having a 1/2 ounce to 1.5 ounce, if I'm out there throwing a 1 ounce spinner, then this rod is really kind of operating at its prime level. And so getting back to really when we're just kind of fishing some of these smaller rivers, medium-sized rivers that we have here in the Pacific Northwest, I typically like going with the 9'6", and that's because it gives me that ability to get these lures out a little bit further if I need to. And also these rods have a good backbone to them, which allows me to handle the fish. And your rod is crucial when it comes to fighting some of these fish, because it takes a lot of that stress and those pressures that those fish are putting on the rod itself and your line and your reel and just the full spectrum of things. So just a couple things to consider when it comes to rods. Something just kind of, as I said, in between 9-10 foot range, and maybe something medium, so it's got that decent backbone so you can handle those bigger fish. Now, when we're talking about reels, it's another one I like to keep simple, and as I've brought up in some other videos, really the reel that you need is something, if you're new to this and you're going out and you're trying to pick one up, just find something that just feels good in your hands, but also it's going to say on these reels, again, it's going to give you some specs that are telling you what it is that you're able to put on these reels. And for these ones, I'm typically fishing braid, which we'll get to. And another way, which I absolutely love, which any of you guys that have followed the channels probably saw quite a few videos where I'm out there fishing with this Cabela's Pro Guide with this Quantum Pulse bait caster on there, and it was a great setup for me. And one of the things that I think I like most about having a bait caster, and I get asked a lot if I prefer the bait caster over the spinning, but I would have to say no. But what I do like about it is, I would say, it's castability. For one, I can rocket my lures out super far, further than I've ever been able to with a spinning setup. And I think that's simply because we're straight lining our spinner out to where it is that we're casting, as opposed to using a spinning reel. And as it's coming off of your bail, it's got that loop going on, which, you know, it kind of has to shoot through your eyelets. And I think that kind of slows it down a little bit. And so I do at times prefer having a bait caster if I'm fishing an area that is big enough where I really need to be rocketing lures out there. And I would say Lower Columbia River or something like that. Something that's a big river where I don't mind getting out as far as possible. Now, what we're putting on these reels is fishing with braided line. I love fishing with braided line for a lot of reasons that we won't get into right now. But typically with these setups, when I'm out here targeting winter steelhead, I'm in between a 20-pound and maybe even a 40-pound braided line. And then, so what we're using is some Power Pro high vis yellow. I like being able to see my line in the water, and it helps me know kind of where my stuff is at, and it helps me better manipulate my line to manipulate the lure that's underneath the water as well. And I like matching that up with our leader, but it really kind of depends on the water conditions, and if it's, again, you know, factors that go into it. So a lot of factors. And so for most of us that have been fishing for a while, I know we don't have one size. We like having multiple sizes to be able to fish those different conditions and different leader lengths. So when we're talking about winter steelhead, I'm usually in between a 10-pound up to maybe a 17, and I do have some 20 here that I really wouldn't use unless we're talking about some high flow conditions and being out maybe on the Sandy River and things are really dirty. And I would go with Seagar. Seagar is just a brand that is, I like it. It's worked for me. I've tried multiple brands. I don't really say I like one over the other. So whatever you guys can get out there and afford, especially if you're just getting into this, just find a fluorocarbon that you can afford. The name brand, I don't think is really gonna make a big, huge difference when you're first getting into this. But we're talking about fluorocarbon. So one of the reasons that we're talking about using a fluorocarbon leader is because steelhead are a lot more line shy than, say, coho and Chinook salmon. So if a steelhead sees your line in the water, it is very likely that you're gonna scare that fish off, or it's just not gonna want anything to do with your lure or your spinner. So having a fluorocarbon, I think, highly increases your chances of hooking a fish. All right, guys, and that brings us to spinners. And so there's a ton of spinners out there on the market, but really there's probably about 3 different styles that are really my favorites and my go-tos. And that's gonna be, and I know you guys have seen these out there, the Blue Fox. It's got that bell body style to it. And I like the Blue Fox because it puts off that nice sound to it. But in my opinion, I don't think winter steelhead are so much attracted to that sound as much as they are just the simple action. Because in my opinion, I think winter steelhead are more of a reactive kind of fish. Another one we've got out there is more of this teardrop style. It's a Panther Martin. Great lure. It's worked very well for me in the past. And again, they've got a wide selection of sizes and colors out there on the market. Now, my go-to, it used to be Blue Fox, you guys. And if you guys have been around and seen, been around the channel for a while, then you've seen that Blue Fox, I swore up and down by Blue Fox, and I still do, because that is what I first started fishing with when it came to targeting salmon and steelhead around here, and it was very effective for me. But in the last year or so, I'd have to say I'm really falling in love with these torpedo styles. And I used them down in the Lower Columbia, and it's just something about me. It just goes back to that simple action, simple lure, and it catches fish. So there's just a couple of options, and like I said, I'll put out a video here in the very near future covering basically the lures and the colors that have worked the best for me when it comes to targeting winter steelhead. All right, so now let's get to the fun part of tying this thing up. Now, there's multiple ways of doing this. There's one that is my preferred method, and one that I actually originally started out with when I first started fishing with spinners before swapping to this setup. And what I'm talking about is going with a line-to-line knot. So instead of using a swivel, we're actually just tying our lines together, so braid to our fluorocarbon. Now, I'm using a uni-to-uni knot on this. And if you guys are unfamiliar with how to tie that knot, and also the uni knot itself, which is what I use to tie on my spinners, I'll put up a link at the end of this video which covers the uni knot and its multiple uses. And so that is the line to line. Now, what I originally started out with was using a little tiny swivel on there, and this thing's rated for 30 pounds. But I find that when you use a swivel, it takes away from the action on your spinner. So if this thing is up here spinning with your spinner, then this spinning is actually taken away from the action on your spinner. So I think to go out and fish this most effectively, if you can get away with doing a line-to-line knot, then you're going to be better off. All right, so with that knot done, now we've got our lines tied together so we can get down to the end of our line here and get the business end taken care of. Now, as I brought up earlier, when I'm tying on my spinners, I usually like to go with the uni knot. Really no specific reason, but it's just something that seems to have worked out for me in the past, and so I just kind of stick with it. So you guys use whatever it is that you feel most comfortable and confident using, and get your spinner tied on. I'm going to tie on this new AFCO torpedo spinner in the new Nightmare pattern. So I'm looking forward to getting out on the river this season and tracking down some fish. So let's go ahead and get these spinners tied on. All right, so with our lure tied on, our rig is now complete, ready to go out and be fished. One thing I will add on though is a little bit of scent can go a long way. And so I always use scent when I'm fishing with spinners because you never know when that can be the big game changer. And why not add something that is potentially going to help you get a fish? So I've got a couple here from Procure. There's a bunch of them out there on the market. I like these ones. They seem to stick onto your lures the longest, so you can get more casts out of them before having to reapply it. So again, just a little thing that can go a long way. So I know you guys can just go out there and kind of see what's available and experiment and kind of see what's going to work best for you. Now to fishing with spinners, and honestly, I think that some of the most aggressive fish that I've ever caught have come while fishing with spinners. Now, there's multiple ways of going out and approaching how you want to fish an area, but there seems to kind of be a little bit of a standard on how, where you want to cast when you go out with different techniques. This rule kind of applies, and it's kind of thinking of the river as like a grid. And you want to go out, and for one, when I approach an area, I try and be stealthy, you guys, and I try and figure it out where it is that I'm going to start fishing before I even get up to the water, because you don't know how close those fish are going to be to the bank. So for one, I try and pick out my spot from a little bit of a standoffish distance and figure out, okay, from this area, am I going to be able to be working upriver, or am I going to be working downriver? And so what I'll do is I'm approaching the area. I want to be able to cast as close to the bank as I can at first and then start working my way out. So the last thing you want to do is just come trumpling through the sticks and the trees and just go splash down in the water up to waist deep water and start blasting your lure or spinner across the river, because that might go and get you a fish on the other side of the river. But this more subtle approach could likely land you multiple fish and make for a much better day. So what I like to do is kind of sneak up on the area, figure out where it is I'm going to start, how I'm going to approach it. And then my very first cast is going to be just a couple of feet off of the bank. Now, the best way I think to try and explain it is if you're not good on angles, if I'm trying to say 45 degree angle, up, down river, you can just kind of think of it as when you walk up to the river, as across the bank is, you're looking at a clock. And so 10 to 2, basically giving somebody some loves, 10 to 2 right there is basically where you want to be fishing. And so your first cast, just make it a couple feet off the bank, upriver, so you can work it down. So you're gonna want to cast out, a couple feet out, 45 degree angle, slowly work your lure back in and retrieve it when you're about 45 degree angle downriver. Now after that cast, you're gonna want to just kind of step your way further out into the river, and eventually you'll be able to blast your lure across the river like you've been wanting to do the whole time. But now that you've worked that little section of water, now you're going to be moving either upriver or downriver, something you decided while you were standing back figuring out how you wanted to approach this. So you're only going to take a couple steps either upriver or downriver, and you're going to repeat those same steps. Now, as I was mentioning, when you're looking at the river as a grid, you're not just looking at it as these little sections from, up the river, down the river, but also depths. You could be putting a lure or a spinner right by a fish and it doesn't strike. A lot of the times, these fish are either going to strike out of instinct or reaction, or it's because you simply just put your gear right in their face and they really had no option. So how you approach it could really be crucial. And one big major tip that I think can be the game changer for a lot of you guys is practice. Anybody can tie on a lure and go out there and just start throwing it. Who knows, you might catch a fish, but you need to pay attention to why you caught that fish, what your spinner was doing and what you were doing at that time. Because as I said, anybody can go out and just throw a spinner, but there's different ways that you can manipulate your line, which we're not going to get into in this video because it is actually quite in depth. To go out there and maybe on a sunny day, and this is what I did, and I think this is why I became a little more effective when it comes to targeting salmon and steelhead, is I would go out on a nice, bright, clear, sunny day, and I would pick the brightest lure that I had. Now, it didn't even have to be that there was fish in the river at the time. I just needed those good, clear conditions and a bright lure that I knew I would be able to see from wherever it was that I was standing and fishing from. Now, what you're going to want to do is just make some casts and see what your lure is doing based on what you're doing with your rod and your reel and raising and lowering your tip and your reeling speeds. And once you can kind of really figure out what those currents are doing and how they're affecting your lure, you can begin to manipulate that and get your lure in a much better placement, which will highly increase your catch rate. So there's just a few tips to get this rig set up, and hopefully enough for you guys that are just starting out to be able to get out there, get this set up and be able to get out on the river and try and start hunting down some winter steelhead. I'm going to leave you with these couple of videos that I brought up. So you guys, they got the bead fishing 101 and float fishing 101 up there for those of you guys that are interested. And as always, until next time, you guys, we'll see you out on the water.